Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might actually help you drift off to sleep. The surprisingly ingenious and occasionally desperate ways medieval people survived winter without central heating, electric blankets, or even the luxury of complaining about the thermostat. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. It's January in the year 1347, somewhere in northern England. The sun sets at what feels like 3 in the afternoon, and the wind is howling through every gap in your wooden walls, like an angry ghost with a personal vendetta. There's no furnace humming in the basement, no heated car to warm up in, and definitely no heated floors to pad across in your fuzzy slippers. Just you, your family, and the very real possibility that you might wake up with icicles in your beard. Medieval winters weren't just cold, they were existentially threatening. The kind of cold that made people question their life choices and wonder if moving to that nice warm monastery down the road was such a bad idea after all. But here's the remarkable thing. People not only survived these winters, they developed an entire arsenal of warming techniques that were equal parts brilliant and bizarre. Let's start with the most obvious solution, fire. But medieval fire wasn't the convenient flip of a switch warmth we know today. It was a high-maintenance relationship that required constant attention, careful feeding, and the occasional sacrifice of furniture when the kindling ran low. Most homes had a central hearth, essentially a fire pit, in the middle of the main room with a hole in the roof to let the smoke escape, in theory. In practice, much of that smoke decided to take a scenic tour of your lungs before finding its way skyward. The wealthy might have had proper fireplaces with chimneys, a luxury that didn't become common until the 12th century. Before that, everyone lived in what was essentially a controlled house fire situation. You learned to sleep with one eye open, not because of burglars, but because sparks had a habit of jumping onto straw bedding when you least expected it. Keeping that fire alive was a full-time job. Someone had to tend it through the night, adding logs, adjusting the airflow, and praying it didn't die out completely. Because restarting a fire in medieval times wasn't a matter of striking a match. You needed flint, steel, tinder, patience, and a vocabulary colourful enough to make a sailor blush when things didn't go according to plan. But fire was just the beginning. Medieval people understood that staying warm was about more than just generating heat. It was about trapping it, conserving it, and making every precious calorie count. Which brings us to one of their most effective strategies, the strategic sharing of body heat. And yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. In medieval households, privacy was a luxury most people couldn't afford, especially in winter. Entire families would sleep together in one bed, not because they were particularly close-knit, but because survival trumped personal space. Children were sandwiched between parents, grandparents were tucked in wherever they fit, and sometimes even the family dog was invited to contribute its warmth to the collective effort. It was like a medieval version of those emperor penguins huddling together in Antarctica, except with more snoring and the occasional elbow to the ribs. This wasn't limited to families either. Travelers staying at inns expected to share beds with complete strangers. The phrase strange bedfellows takes on new meaning when you realize it originated from people literally sleeping next to whoever happened to need a place to stay that night. Sure, you might wake up next to a merchant from 3 towns over who talked in his sleep about turnip prices, but you also woke up warm and with all your extremities still attached. Even animals got in on the action. Livestock weren't just kept for food and labor, they were living, breathing heaters. Many peasant homes were built with the family living quarters directly above the animal pens. The body heat from cows, pigs, and chickens would rise through gaps in the floorboards, creating a sort of biological central heating system. It wasn't exactly pleasant, what with the smells and the occasional mooing at inappropriate hours, but it was effective. Nothing says medieval charm quite like falling asleep to the gentle sounds of livestock settling in for the night just below your bed. For those who could afford it, there were more sophisticated warming techniques. The wealthy had access to braziers, metal containers filled with hot coals that could be moved from room to room. These were like medieval space heaters, except they came with the added excitement of potential carbon monoxide poisoning and the ever-present risk of accidentally setting your tapestries ablaze. Hot stones were another popular option. Large rocks would be heated in the fire, then wrapped in cloth and placed at the foot of the bed, or carried around like medieval hand warmers. The key was getting the temperature just right. Too cool and they were useless. Too hot, and you'd wake up with burns that would make you question whether hypothermia might have been the better option after all. Then there were the warming pans, essentially long-handled metal containers filled with hot coals that were run between the sheets before bedtime. Servants would slide these contraptions back and forth under the blankets, warming the bed like a medieval clothes iron. It was effective, but it required a delicate touch. Move too quickly, and you'd scatter hot coals across your sleeping area. Move too slowly, and you'd end up with scorch marks that would forever remind you of that one time you almost burned down the manor house trying to stay warm. Clothing was another crucial element in the medieval warming arsenal. People layered like their lives depended on it, which they often did. The basic principle was simple. Trap air between layers of fabric to create insulation. But medieval clothing wasn't designed with comfort in mind. It was wool, mostly rough wool, that itched like 1,000 tiny needles and smelled like wet sheep after a few weeks of continuous wear. Washing clothes in winter was a Herculean task that involved breaking ice, heating water over a fire, and then somehow drying everything without it freezing solid. Most people simply wore the same garments for months at a time, adding layers as the temperature dropped, and hoping that body odor was a small price to pay for not dying of exposure. By spring, removing these clothes required either great courage or complete loss of the sense of smell. The wealthy had access to furs, which were not only warmer but also served as status symbols. A good fur coat could mean the difference between a comfortable winter and a miserable one, assuming you could afford it and weren't too concerned about the previous owner's opinion on the matter. Ermine, fox, and beaver were particularly prized, though acquiring them often involved complex trade networks that stretched across medieval Europe. But perhaps the most ingenious warming technique was the medieval understanding of nutrition and internal heat generation. People knew that certain foods could warm you from the inside out, and winter diets were planned accordingly. Spices weren't just for flavor, they were for survival. Pepper, ginger, cinnamon, and cloves weren't just exotic luxuries for the wealthy. They were medieval heating systems you could eat. These spices increased circulation, raised body temperature, and made even the blandest porridge feel like a warming elixir. A hot meal wasn't just sustenance, it was fuel for your internal furnace. People would consume enormous quantities of pottage, a thick stew that simmered for hours and could burn your tongue if you weren't careful. The goal wasn't culinary excellence. It was converting calories into precious body heat as efficiently as possible. Alcohol played its part too, though not always in the way you might expect. While a cup of warmed wine or ale could provide temporary relief from the cold, medieval people understood that alcohol's warming effect was largely illusory. It made you feel warmer by dilating blood vessels near the skin, but it actually increased heat loss in the long run. Still, when you're facing another 14-hour night of darkness and your toes have lost all feeling, a mug of mulled cider started to look like liquid courage rather than liquid stupidity. The truly desperate turned to more creative solutions. Some people would fill clay pots with hot water and use them as primitive hot water bottles, clutching them close to their bodies throughout the night. Others would heat bricks or stones and wrap them in cloth, creating makeshift heating pads that retained warmth for hours. There are even records of people heating sand and pouring it into leather pouches. Though this required considerable skill to avoid creating a medieval version of a sand volcano in your bed, churches became unofficial warming centres during the worst winter months. The massive stone buildings retained heat well, and the body warmth of congregations could make even the most drafty cathedral bearable. Services became longer during winter, not necessarily due to increased piety, but because nobody wanted to leave the relative warmth of the nave to face the bitter cold outside. Some people would arrive early and stay late, treating the church like a medieval community centre with the added benefit of potentially earning some spiritual points for their dedication. Monasteries developed particularly sophisticated heating systems. Some had hypercausts, underground heating systems borrowed from Roman engineering, where hot air from furnaces was channeled through hollow walls and floors. These weren't common, but they demonstrated that medieval people weren't simply resigned to freezing. They were constantly innovating, adapting, and finding new ways to outsmart the weather. The wealthy had access to what were essentially medieval heated floors. Hot coals or stones were placed in specially designed chambers beneath stone floors, radiating heat upward through the living spaces above. This required considerable planning and investment, but it created rooms when the outside that remained warm, even temperature dropped below freezing. Of course, it also required servants who were willing to crawl around in smoky underground chambers, constantly tending these heating systems and hoping they didn't accidentally asphyxiate themselves in the process. Textiles played a crucial role beyond just clothing. Tapestries weren't just decorative, they were insulation. Heavy woven hangings could be pulled across doorways and windows to block drafts, creating smaller, more manageable spaces to heat. Beds were surrounded by curtains that could be drawn shut, creating a microclimate within a room. These bed curtains trapped body heat and blocked drafts, turning each bed into a personal warming chamber. Some of these hangings were so thick that once you pulled them closed, you couldn't hear what was happening in the rest of the room. Windows presented a particular challenge, glass effective at keeping cold air out. Most was expensive and often not very people made do with oiled cloth, thin sheets of animal horn, or simply wooden shutters. In the depths of winter, many windows were simply boarded up entirely. Living in perpetual darkness was considered preferable to dealing with the constant draft that even the best medieval window coverings couldn't eliminate. The concept of central heating existed in some form, though it was primitive compared to modern systems. Some castles and large manor houses had networks of flues and air shafts that could distribute heat from central fires to multiple rooms. These systems were temperamental at best and frequently filled living spaces with smoke, but they represented genuine attempts to solve the heating problem on a larger scale. Kitchens became the heart of medieval homes during winter, not just because that's where food was prepared, but because they were often the warmest rooms in the house. Cooking fires burned throughout the day. Ovens radiated heat long after baking was finished, and the constant activity of food preparation generated additional warmth. Families would gather in kitchens, not just for meals, but for warmth, conversation, and the simple pleasure of feeling their fingers and toes again. Some people developed elaborate sleeping arrangements that would seem bizarre by modern standards. Heated stones were placed at the foot of beds hours before bedtime. Multiple layers of blankets, furs, and even spare clothing were piled on top of sleepers. Some beds were built into alcoves or corners, where they could be surrounded by curtains on 3 sides, creating maximum insulation. The goal wasn't comfort in any sense we'd recognize today. It was simply avoiding death by freezing, which was a very real possibility during particularly harsh winters. The wealthy sometimes employed human bed warmers, servants whose job was to lie in their master's bed for a period before bedtime, warming the sheets with their own body heat. Once the bed was sufficiently warmed, they would vacate the space just before their employer retired for the night. It was probably one of the stranger job descriptions in medieval employment, but it was considered a legitimate service in households that could afford such luxuries. Personal warming devices became increasingly sophisticated among those who could afford them. Hand warmers made from perforated metal containers filled with hot coals could be carried around during daily activities. Foot warmers, essentially small boxes with hot coals inside, were placed under desks or tables where people worked. These devices required constant attention and posed significant fire risks, but they made the difference between productive work and sitting in misery, waiting for spring to arrive. Even bathing presented unique challenges during medieval winters. Most people simply didn't bathe regularly during the cold months, which sounds horrifying by modern standards, but was actually a practical survival decision. Water was difficult to heat in large quantities, and getting wet in freezing temperatures could be genuinely life-threatening. When bathing was absolutely necessary, it was done quickly in small amounts of heated water, often in front of the fire. The wealthy might have had access to heated bathhouses, but for most people, staying clean in winter meant spot cleaning with warm cloths and hoping that layers of clothing would mask any resulting odors until spring arrived. The concept of seasonal migration wasn't uncommon among those who had the means. Wealthy families often moved their entire households to warmer regions during the worst winter months, essentially becoming medieval snowbirds. They would pack up their portable belongings, including tapestries, furniture, and even windows, and relocate to southern properties where the climate was more forgiving. This wasn't a vacation. It was a survival strategy that could mean the difference between a comfortable winter and one spent fighting hypothermia in a drafty northern castle. For those who couldn't escape to warmer climates, the development of winter schedules became crucial. People learned to time their activities around the available warmth. Work that required dexterity was done during the warmest part of the day, usually midday, when the sun provided whatever meager heat it could manage. Evening activities were planned around the fire, with families gathering to share stories, mend clothing, or work on crafts that could be done while huddled together for warmth. Sleep patterns changed dramatically during winter months. The concept of a solid 8-hour sleep wasn't practical when staying warm required constant attention. Many people practiced segmented sleep, sleeping in shorter periods with wakeful intervals used to tend fires, check on animals, or simply move around enough to prevent their blood from freezing. Some would sleep for a few hours, wake to stoke the fire and add fuel, then return to sleep until the fire needed attention again. The role of community became even more important during harsh winters. Neighbors would take turns hosting gatherings in the warmest available space, sharing both heat and resources. These weren't social calls, they were survival strategies. By combining body heat and sharing fuel costs, communities could create warming centers that individual families couldn't maintain on their own. Stories, songs, and games weren't just entertainment. They were ways to pass long, dark hours while conserving energy and staying close to heat sources. Food storage and preparation took on added importance as both sustenance and heating strategy. Root cellars weren't just for keeping food from spoiling. They provided relatively warm spaces where people could work during the worst weather. The fermentation process of brewing ale or preserving vegetables actually generated small amounts of heat, and these activities were often scheduled for the coldest months when any additional warmth was welcome. Some medieval communities developed sophisticated communal heating arrangements. Entire villages might share large ovens or heating systems, with families taking turns maintaining the fires and sharing the resulting warmth. Public bathhouses, where they existed, became community warming centers as much as places for hygiene. The Roman tradition of hypocaust heating was adapted and maintained in some areas, creating public spaces where people could gather to escape the worst of winter's bite. The psychological aspects of surviving medieval winters were just as important as the physical strategies. People developed rituals and traditions around warmth that helped maintain morale during the darkest months. Feast days were strategically placed during winter, to provide both physical nourishment and emotional relief. The sharing of warm food and heated drinks became ceremonial acts that reinforced social bonds and provided hope that spring would eventually return. Clothing maintenance became a crucial winter skill. People learned to repair and adjust their garments to maximize warmth retention. Stuffing clothing with straw, leaves, or animal fur created additional insulation layers. Sewing techniques were adapted to minimize gaps where cold air could penetrate. Some people would literally sew themselves into their winter clothes, creating sealed garments that couldn't be easily removed but provided maximum protection against the elements. The development of winter games and activities helped people stay active enough to maintain circulation while conserving energy. Indoor activities that generated movement without requiring people to venture outside became popular during the coldest months. Dancing, wrestling, and other physical activities weren't just entertainment. They were ways to generate body heat and keep blood flowing to extremities that might otherwise suffer frostbite. Even the wealthy faced significant challenges in staying warm. Their large castles and manor houses were notoriously difficult to heat effectively. Stone walls conducted cold efficiently, and the high ceilings that looked impressive during summer months became thermal nightmares in winter. Wealthy families often retreated to smaller rooms during the coldest months, essentially living like peasants, but with better furnishings and more reliable food supplies. The breeding and care of animals took on added importance during winter months. Animals weren't just sources of food and labor, they were living heat generators that required protection from the cold. Farmers learned to balance keeping animals warm enough to survive, while also benefiting from their body heat. Barns became sophisticated heat management systems, where human and animal needs were carefully balanced. Medieval people also understood the importance of wind protection. Buildings were oriented and constructed to minimize exposure to prevailing winter winds. Temporary structures like windbreaks and barriers were erected around homes and animal pens to create microclimates that were slightly warmer than the surrounding area. Even small reductions in wind exposure could make significant differences in the perceived temperature and the amount of fuel needed for heating. The timing of seasonal activities was carefully planned around heating requirements. Brewing, baking, and other activities that generated heat were scheduled for the coldest days. Large cooking projects were undertaken not just for food preparation, but as heating events that would warm living spaces for hours after the cooking was complete. Even laundry, when absolutely necessary, was timed to take advantage of the heat generated by boiling water and the steam from drying clothes. The ingenuity of medieval heating extended to the tools and implements people used in their daily lives. Eating utensils weren't just functional, they were designed with warmth in mind. Wooden spoons and bowls retained heat longer than metal ones, keeping food warmer during the slow process of eating by firelight. Clay vessels were preferred for hot drinks because they held temperature well and could be cupped in cold hands to transfer warmth to frozen fingers. Even the shape of drinking cups evolved to maximize the warming effect, with wide, shallow bowls that allowed people to warm their faces with steam while sipping heated beverages. The wealthy developed elaborate rituals around staying warm that bordered on theatrical. Morning warming ceremonies involved servants heating clothing before their masters dressed, warming chairs before they were occupied, and even heating writing implements so that important correspondence could be completed without the writer's hands going numb. Some wealthy households employed professional fire tenders whose sole responsibility was maintaining optimal temperatures throughout living spaces, adjusting fuel loads and airflow with the precision of modern thermostats. Sleeping arrangements became increasingly complex as people learned to maximize warmth retention during the long winter nights. Beds were constructed with built-in storage compartments where heated stones could be placed and replaced throughout the night. Some beds featured multiple levels of mattresses stuffed with different materials, each designed to trap air and create insulation layers. The wealthiest might have beds with hollow frames where small braziers could be placed, creating heated sleeping surfaces that remained warm throughout the night. The concept of seasonal clothing storage took on life or death importance. Summer clothes weren't just put away, they were repurposed as insulation material. Lightweight fabrics were stuffed into gaps in walls, used as additional blanket layers, or even worn under heavier winter garments to create air pockets. Nothing was wasted when it came to potential insulation, and people became expert at layering different types of fabric to maximize warmth while maintaining enough mobility to perform essential tasks. Medieval people also developed sophisticated understanding of thermal dynamics that wouldn't look out of place in a modern engineering textbook. They knew that heat rises, so upper floors of multi-story buildings were reserved for winter living when possible. They understood that smaller spaces heat more efficiently than larger ones, so families would literally wall off sections of their homes during the coldest months, creating cozy chambers that required less fuel to maintain comfortable temperatures. The role of thermal mass in medieval heating was crucial, though most people understood it instinctively rather than scientifically. Stone walls, brick ovens, and clay hearths weren't just structural elements, they were heat batteries that absorbed warmth during the day and released it slowly throughout the night. Smart builders oriented these massive elements to capture and store as much heat as possible from fires, sun exposure, and human activity. Even personal hygiene adapted to the demands of staying warm. Hair was grown longer during winter months, not just for fashion, but for insulation. Both men and women understood that hair trapped warm air close to the scalp and neck, providing crucial protection for areas where major blood vessels ran close to the skin surface. Beards weren't just masculine statements. They were face warmers that protected against frostbite and wind damage. The development of winter work schedules required careful balance between maintaining productivity and conserving body heat. Tasks that required fine motor control were scheduled for the warmest parts of the day when fingers remained nimble. Heavy physical labor was planned for the coldest periods, when the exertion would generate needed body heat. Even intellectual work like reading or writing was timed around heating schedules, with scholars and scribes working in short bursts near fires rather than attempting long periods of concentration in cold spaces. So there you have it. The remarkable story of how our medieval ancestors turned survival into an art form, transforming bitter winters from death sentences into manageable challenges through nothing but ingenuity, cooperation, and sheer stubborn determination. From shared beds warmed by strangers to heated stones wrapped in cloth, from communal fires tended through the night to spiced ales that burned away the cold from within. They didn't just endure those brutal months, they innovated their way through them. And maybe, just maybe, their resourceful spirit can warm us too, even if it's just enough to help you drift peacefully into sleep. Sweet dreams, and stay warm out there.